my talk about from darkness to light. It's my story of recovery and a journey of mental health resilience. Um, Thank you for having me today. My name is Jason Prinzo. I'm a speaker, advocate, and yes, I'm going to say it. I am a mental health success story. But before I was any of those things, I was one of the millions of people that were ignoring their mental health every single day. And at the time, I chalked it up to that I was just an emotional person or that I just tended to worry more than other people. And I had these deep feelings of feeling unliked, unloved, and alone. And I felt as a young man that that was just a lack of self-confidence, that if I could just become more confident, that these feelings would go away. But I first discovered that I have anxiety, and I suffer from anxiety, depression, and ADHD. And I didn't discover that I had anxiety until probably the worst possible time, and that was my honeymoon. My wife and I had just gotten married. We went away, and for the first couple of days, everything was fine. But come Monday, when I would normally be working, this idea started seeping into my brain that if I didn't work this week, that I was going to be fired. That if the company had a bad week while I was off, that that was going to be my fault and I would be fired. And if they had a good week, that was going to be confirmation that they didn't need me and I would be fired. And this culminated with me starting to have a panic attack at the airport because I was convinced that my job was over, that I was going to come back and not have a job. And I remember my wife grabbed my hands and she looked at me and she says, "You have anxiety. I need you to go get help." And I pulled away and I said, I don't have anxiety. I'm just a stressful person. I'm just wound tight. I need you to have some patience with me. And she grabbed tighter and she said, "You have anxiety and it's not just affecting you, but it's affecting me." And that shook me to my core at that moment. And see, there's a difference between being anxious and anxiety disorder. You know, being anxious is pretty normal. We all go through periods of anxiousness. You might be anxious about a job interview or maybe asking somebody out on a date or event that's coming up. And those feelings are normal. And for most people, it's a fleeting feeling, and that'll go away when the event is over or the job interview is over. But for those of us that have anxiety disorder, we live in this constant state of fear and impending doom. And when an event or something is over that we've been stressing about, it just transfers to somewhere else. And so we're always feeling as if the worst possible outcome is the only possible outcome. And it causes us to kind of live in this state of fight or flight at all times. And our brains create these stories. And it's important to understand that when somebody is in this space, whatever we're thinking is 100% fact at that point. Even if it sounds ridiculous at the time and it sounds as if um, what we're saying could never possibly happen, we are 100% convinced that this is the truth. And one of the things that we need to be aware of if you're dealing with somebody that is struggling with anxiety and in this space is we just need confirmation that what we're feeling is okay. There's nothing more frustrating than when you're in this place of fear and as you're telling somebody, the response is something to the effect of, "Well, what do you have to worry about?" Or, "Look at the bright side." Those things don't connect with us at that point. The only thing that's worse than dealing with those feelings of anxiety is now having to argue with somebody else to understand our emotions and understand how we're feeling. And all that's going to do is make us just kind of quiet up and not talk about it at all. We're never going to open up to you again. So it's important to understand that those feelings are 100% truth to us in that moment. And we may move on to something else at some point, but we're always going to live in that state. Now, anxiety is the number one most common form of mental illness. In fact, one out of every three people that are diagnosed with some sort of form of mental illness end up being diagnosed with anxiety. And anxiety can be crippling. Our bodies can react physically. They're sweating, stomach cramps. You can have elevated heart rate, digestive problems. I know for me personally, I feel it in my shoulders. I feel it in my stomach. I get sick to my stomach. And a lot of people will have eye twitching, but there are all these physical indications that something's going on. And that's usually our first sign that we need to take some sort of action. And we'll talk about some of those actionable steps here in a moment. But the way that my anxiety would play out for me as an adult, and this scenario would happen nearly every week, I would call my boss and his assistant might say something to the effect of, "Hey, Dennis can't talk to you right now. He's going to call you back." And from the time the phone left my ear until I hung it up, the lie that my brain was telling me was that Dennis is mad at me. I'm going to get fired. We're going to lose the house. My wife is going to leave me. I'm going to be living alone for the rest of my life. And at that point, I completely freeze because I do not know what to take care of first. Do I save my job? Do I try to save my marriage? I need to check the account to find out how much money we have because I need to know how long I can float us until I find another job. And I don't know which one to do. So I just stick in that one space. And eventually, what happens is my boss will call me later that day and everything will be fine. And I'll realize that this was just all made up in my head. And then I'm embarrassed because it's the same thing that I felt last week and the week before that and the week before that. And I can't stop it from happening. Now, there are several factors that come into play when you talk about anxiety disorder. It could be your chemical makeup, it could be your current life situation. You might be struggling with substance abuse, and it could just plain be hereditary. But the leading cause of anxiety disorder is trauma and specifically childhood trauma. I understand why I have anxiety. I understand why I live in this space as an adult. I can draw a through line from my anxiety to the trauma I endured as a kid. My father was the biggest factor in this. In fact, I like to say that my father loved three things in life: drugs, alcohol, and violence. So I'm going to let you know right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about some violence that I endured and that my mother endured. So I just want to make sure that I give people a moment that if this is going to be triggering for you or troubling in any way, that you understand that I'm going to talk about a few of these things. My father's violence started at a really young age. At 4, I can remember being in a car with him and a school bus cut us off. And my father proceeded to follow the school bus until he could block it into a cul-de-sac. And with the school kids still sitting in the back of the bus, my father proceeded to jump out and start banging on the school bus door, trying to get the driver to come out. Unfortunately, the driver didn't leave or didn't come out. My father and I left. But these things were happening on a regular basis, and I was witness to a lot of them. When I was 5 or 6, my parents ended up divorcing. My father's violence kicked up a little bit at that point. And one of the things that would happen on a pretty regular basis, we lived on a horseshoe shaped street that went out to a main drag, and you could go in circles if you needed to. And my father would be waiting outside in his car for my mother and I to leave. And when we would leave, he would come and start ramming his car into the back of ours to get us to stop. And every time my mother would try to get a big enough lead to where she could drive somewhere safe, like a mall, a department store, somewhere public, or she would pull in front of the house. So at 5 and 6 years old, I could jump out, run into the house, and call the police on my father. And again, this was happening on a regular basis. There were other events that were going on at the same time, but this was kind of consistently happening. Now, my mom made the amazing decision a year later to remarry my father, which I was happy about at the time because I wanted my father around. As a young man, it was important for me to have a male figure around. And also, if anybody else comes from a broken home or maybe you didn't have a parent around as a kid, the one that isn't there is the one that we always want the most attention from. My mom was my rock, but I knew she would always be there, and I was craving attention from my father. So my parents were married. They promised they were going to stay together forever. And 1 year after that, they got their second divorce. And that made things worse for my father. My father's alcoholism kicked up and the violence continued. And probably the most traumatic part for me was there were times that my father would drink too much and he would sit outside the house at night. And there were times that he would fire shots into the house. And this was the beginning of a lot of these feelings of anxiety that I just didn't know that I had at that point. And when we experience trauma as a child, we're just not emotionally intelligent enough to understand what's happening. We go into this fight or flight mode and we develop these survival skills and coping mechanisms that kind of turn into muscle memory. There's a lot of isolation. There can be emotional eating, aggression, anger, substance abuse. And we learn these survival skills that are helpful for us at the time, but don't really help us as adults. They're not tools that we need in our tool belt as an adult. We need to find better ways to cope. And I wasn't getting that at the time. I was literally just trying to manage and try to avoid upsetting anybody during the day. I was isolating. I was going through long bouts of sadness that I knew was depression, but I didn't understand what depression meant. And one of the things that we talk about, I talked about how anxiety can be crippling. There are a lot of things that we can do in that moment. Um, and one of the most important, oh, don't want to do that. Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen here. One of the most important things that I've learned is paying attention to my body. Most of the time, our bodies will give us an indication that there is something going on mentally before we kind of figure it out. As I mentioned, there can be stomach cramps. I can start to feel physically sick. You, my shoulders, I don't know that my shoulders lowered from the time I was 5 till I was about 45 because I was constantly in this state of anxiety. But there are a few things that we can do. What I've learned is that when I feel this way and I can feel it coming on, the most important thing that I have to do is to avoid ruminating. Because the longer that I sit and ruminate on what I'm anxious about, the further downhill I'm going to go. And for me, there are a few things that I like to do. One is I like to do box breathing. And box breathing is important for me because I can sit and breathe and do breathing exercises and still stress. I can sit there and still think about whatever is bothering me. But if I do box breathing, I have to concentrate on the cadence. And if you're unfamiliar with box breathing, all it is you hold your breath for 7 seconds, you breathe in for 7, hold for another 7, and then blow out for 7. And you just kind of do this continuously. And it's a great way to reset. And for me, the cadence of keeping up with that is what is able to distract me from whatever I'm ruminating on at that point. Another one for me is quick physical exertion. I work in a shared workspace, and when I can feel this anxiety coming on, I'll go somewhere into a small room by myself. I can do push-ups, run in place, jumping jacks, just anything that will trigger some serotonin to get me out of that space and give me a hard reset. All of those things are really important. And on the side, and we'll talk about some more of this later, anything artistic is always helpful. And this is kind of ongoing. Art, coloring books, music, cooking, puzzles. These are all very positive things that we can do in order to maintain our mental health. Now, as an advocate, I talk quite a bit about my struggles in the past, and talking about my mental health isn't embarrassing at all. It's not scary for me to talk about. I've been dealing with this my entire life, so I'm very comfortable with it. The hardest part for me and the most difficult thing to talk about, and understand I'm going to get emotional a couple of times during this speech. It happens every time. But one of the most difficult things for me to talk about is my constant struggle with masculinity and what that meant to me as a kid. I'm crying now, but I was an emotional kid and I'm an emotional adult. And I couldn't understand how can someone who cries and feels emotion as much as I do, how is that masculine? Because we're taught that men are strong, tough, we push through pain. We're allowed to be angry. You can be angry, but you better not cry. Now, my father, what was happening? And it didn't help that when my father and mother got divorced the second time and the violence kicked up, my mother and I ended up just kind of on the run for a while. There were no stalking laws back then. And anytime my father found out where we lived, we would have to move. And what this caused was I was changing schools nearly every year. I went to 8 schools in 12 years by the time I graduated. And unfortunately, I was making friends and losing them all in the same year. And everybody had an expiration date. So the abandonment was continuing to build up. And I lived in this place of feeling unloved, unworthy, that I didn't have any redeeming qualities of being a friend to somebody or being loved. I didn't know how to be masculine enough to have male friends. I thought that I was looked at as an outcast, and I isolated a lot. I spent a lot of time alone as a young boy, and I went through long bouts of depression. Although I didn't understand what depression was at the time, I had been taught that word before, and but I was never given any tools or skills in order to overcome it. And my mother wasn't giving any signs to look for, so she didn't know what to do either. And we're never taught any of these things. So when we're growing up, we are never given tools in order to how to emotionally respond to the things that are happening. We're never taught conflict resolution, and we're building these tools on our own that aren't useful. And so a lot of times when somebody is struggling with depression, they will begin to isolate. Let me pull this up here. Sorry. Share screen. We'll start to isolate. You'll see a lot of people. This is a big one that they'll lose interest in hobbies or activities. There's a lot of anger and irritability. That is something I really struggled with. Uh, Weight loss is another big sign. There's feelings of worthlessness, constant fatigue. The funny thing about that one is you can either sleep too much and not get out of bed. But one of the worst things is when you can't sleep at all, but you can't get out of bed because those days are really long. If you're laying in bed and you're feeling in this sad state, but you don't want to watch television, you can't listen to music, you're just laying there, those days get really long. And unfortunately, depression can feel as if it's never going away. And it's one of the reasons why people go to such a bad place because it just feels like it's never leaving and that we're going to live the rest of our lives feeling this way. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't aware of my anxiety as a kid. I knew I was diagnosed with depression, but what I found out as an adult was anxiety was kind of my gateway drug to depression, where I spent so much time trying to fight off the sadness and depression. What I really should have been doing is managing my anxiety because my anxiety would build up, lead to me getting depressed, and then that would send me into a bad place. And unfortunately, one of the things that goes along with depression are thoughts of suicide and suicide ideations. Now, I want to give you a quick warning. I am going to talk about suicide for a moment. So if this is going to be triggering to anybody, please take a moment. I completely understand. There was a day that I realized I had made it. I found myself living in life that I never dreamed of. I Despite having no formal education, a traumatic childhood, I had carved out a successful 25-year career in the music industry. I had held VP jobs at Warner Brothers and Capitol Records. I was traveling the country. I was going on tour with bands. I had been to the Golden Globes, the Grammys, Masters tournaments. I was living this life that I never dreamt of. And I remember sitting there thinking, it's all lining up. I made it. I can be happy now. Now's the time that I can be happy and enjoy life. And as I was standing in the middle of what should have been the best chapter of my life, I was completely miserable. As far as anybody knew, I had it together. You would have never known from the outside. If you would have asked anybody, they would have thought I was confident, successful, happy. But my anxiety was off the charts. And I fit into this section called smiling depression. And it's not a clinical diagnosis, but we call it smiling depression because it's somebody that appears to have it all together, is the life of the party, is holding down a steady job, but inside they're suffering really badly. And that was me. And I was so afraid of losing it all. I was so afraid that it was all going to catch up with me because I didn't deserve this position that I was in. I felt like I didn't deserve my dad. I've been fooling people for 25 years. This is all going to be taken away from me. And how am I going to handle that when it happens? I still wasn't managing my mental health. I was still ignoring it, even though all of the signs were there. And in 2020, I became suicidal for the first time. And the only time, let me start by saying that it was the only time I've been suicidal. I It was 2020. There were a lot of things going on, and I had never thought about suicide as a child, even though I obviously had a very difficult and sad childhood. It wasn't something that I ever crossed my mind. But when I was 18, I had a good friend of mine die by suicide, and something about it stuck. And I remember every day of my life, I thought about suicide every single day. And it wasn't that I planned on doing it. It was that I was keeping it as an option, that if things got bad enough, I always had this out. And in 2020, I realized that I was normalizing it. I knew how I was going to do it. I knew where I was going to do it. And I knew that I was going to do it in a way that nobody I loved would find me. The hardest thing that I ever had to do in my life was to go to my wife, the person that makes me the most happy, and tell her that life was too hard for me. Fortunately for me, I have a very supportive wife, and we immediately went and got me some help. I checked into a facility, an outpatient facility for 2 weeks, and I was very honest with everybody around me. I told my friends, I told coworkers, because at that point, I needed people to know that what I was going through was very normal. That even though most of us hide these feelings, I know other people are feeling it. And if I can be honest about mine, other people can be honest about theirs. And these 2 weeks that I spent at the facility, we did one-on-one therapy, we did group therapy, and the things that I learned have saved my life. And they have put me on a trajectory that I've consider myself a mental health success story because I have never been in a better place. I'll continue to go through this fight and I'll continue to battle this every day because it is not beatable. But learning to manage has been extremely important for me. Now, one of the things that I like to do, I'm going to give you some ideas here of things that I do in order to help me cope. And let's go back to this shared screen here. One of the biggest things I like is I have a happy list. And all my happy list is there are a list of things, big and small, that make me happy and give me some pleasure. And it could be anything as big as traveling. It could be taking a bath. I love going to a coffee shop and grabbing some coffee. It's relaxing to me. I like to listen to music. Whatever it is, put this on a list and try to work one of these things in every day. This is a form of self-care. And it is okay to take 10, 15 minutes every single day to do something that makes you feel good. Uh, um, I carve out time every day for one of these. I think it's important to take mental health days without feeling guilt in any way. Mental health is just like any other health, any sort of physical health. And if we're not feeling well, it is absolutely okay to take a mental health day. There's no embarrassment in that. There's no reason that you have to try to power through if you're not mentally there. Journaling is another one that's extremely helpful. I find for myself when I'm writing stuff down at night, when I'm done, I go back and read it and I can read how ridiculous some of the things that I'm feeling may sound in that moment because I'm writing everything down. But when I read it, I'm like, oh, this is exactly what this is. But just the sheer fact of getting it out can be positive, and reading it back is helpful. And there are times where if I'm in a bad place, I'll go back and read old entries just so I can figure out what the pattern was for me or how I helped get myself out of it. Uh, this is one that most people don't think about. if I've had 4 or 5 bad days in a row, I will go to my closet and I will grab the 2 or 3 things that I feel the absolute best in. And we all have those clothes that when we put them on, we feel like we look great and we're our most confident. There are times where I need to do that just to get in a better mental health space. And it's been extremely effective for me. Positive responses, I'm huge on this. When somebody asks me how I'm doing, my response is always, I'm doing great, fantastic, wonderful. What ends up happening is, even if I'm not feeling that way, just continuing to say it will if you're in a bad place, but we have to remember to do these and to be diligent in trying to get them done. When it comes to talk therapy, I know that there's a stigma behind it. And the way that I try to relate it to people is we eat diets to avoid heart disease. We work out in order to stay physically healthy, but we don't do anything about our mental health until there's a problem. We wait until we're at rock bottom before we do anything about it. So if we started to think about therapists as a trainer for our brains, just like we would a trainer in the gym, we tell the trainer at the gym, hey, I want to lose weight. I want to put muscle on here. We go through the whole thing. A therapist is the exact same way. And as you can see on here, 86% of people that have gone to therapy report that they experience symptom relief and improved functioning. And one of the important things to know, if you haven't done therapy before, there can be a kind of a stigma from television and movies that you're just going to be laying on this leather couch, digging into trauma while somebody sits and takes notes. And that's not necessarily the case. For me, I do therapy once a week, and probably the biggest focus on my therapy is learning how to move through life with the results of what happened to me as a kid. I know what my trauma was. I know what happened. I need to learn how to manage these things so they don't take over me as an adult. Going to therapy improves physical health. You learn stress management. There's increased self awareness. All those things are extremely positive, and I can't recommend talk therapy enough. I know that it's not for everybody, but for me, it has been life saving, and it's been an extension of the things that I learned when I went to the facility in order to get very direct treatment. Get out of this here. So we are not in a mental health crisis. We've always been in this place. And I'm just glad that conversations like this are open for us and that we're allowing ourselves to feel these things and to talk openly about it. We have to get past this stigma that mental health and struggling with depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar disorder, there should be shame in this. Just like there's no shame if anybody has diabetes or anything else. These are all very natural things that happen to us, and there are more of us struggling with this than ever before. And I just ask that everybody have some compassion and love. Let's lead with love. Arlene and I talked about this before we got on this call. Every one of us are just doing our best, and we're trying to manage our way through life. So I think it's important that we show each other some patience and understand that not everybody is doing things to try to hurt you or harm you. Everybody's just trying to get by. So let's have some compassion for each other. Let's show each other some love, and let's pay attention to the people around us. The one thing that I want to leave you with, check on each other. Call people that you haven't talked to in a while. Please reach out to people that you haven't spoken to and just say hi, just say hello. When we're in a bad place, when I'm struggling, just hearing from somebody is enough to continue for me to go on. It's enough to make me feel like somebody cares. You don't have to call and ask very deep questions. Just reach out. Be there for somebody and allow them to be there for you. Thank you guys so much. I will take some questions now. I'm looking, I will put the slide back up about managing anxiety. I'll do that right now. There we go. There's that slide.
So we have a few comments.
Sure.
Great topic, really relatable. And one person also shared that um, his or her depression was also tied to her or his anxiety.
Yes. I didn't understand that because obviously was told that I had depression and that was my only focus. And it took me a long time to realize that if I could get in front of my anxiety, if I could do some of these tools that we talked about, that it can keep me from spiraling and going to that place because I'm struggling with it right now. I had a disagreement with somebody yesterday, and it's really not that big a deal, but I've been ruminating on it for 24 hours and it is tearing at me. And I have to remember that I have to also do some of these suggestions that I'm doing for everybody else because it'll eat at me. My anxiety is difficult. It is hard to get your mind off of whatever you're worrying about at that time. I'm going through it right now.
Jason, is there such a thing like, do you know when it's going to happen or that you can prevent or, minimize it or something?
That's when I start to pay attention to my body. When I talked about the headaches or, my shoulders rising up, or I feel it in my stomach a lot. It'll feel like an upset stomach, but that's normally my indication that I'm starting to feel something mentally that I need to take care of. So there's not necessarily a warning sign ahead of time unless you're going to an event or something that you may run into a family member that may be traumatic. My wife also struggles with some family history, and she went back to visit her family this past weekend. And I'm very proud, man, I'm very proud of my wife because she's 7 months sober, but she didn't think about what that was going to mean when she went home. And when she went home, it all came flooding back. And she was upset with herself that she didn't think about that beforehand. So sometimes there are things coming up that no may be triggering, and we have to be able to prepare for that. And the things that I told her there were, if you feel like you need to get out of there, go for a walk. If you feel like you want to come home, come home. Protecting our mental health is much more important than making family happy, making our friends happy. We can't allow ourselves to go to a bad place because our family expects us to be around. And it is okay to take that moment for yourself. It is okay to leave that situation. It is mentally dangerous for us, and our mental health is of the utmost importance.
Thank you, Jason. We have additional comments here. Thank you for opening the lid on this important topic. I have a family member who similarly, anxiety is key to their mental health, and there is so much still have to learn to connect and support her.
I think I spoke about it a little earlier. Uh, In those moments, nobody can talk us out of how we're feeling, right? We believe that the worst possible scenario, the worst possible outcome is the only outcome. I used to feel like my brain was just preparing me for what could happen, but I realized that all my brain was telling me was that this is what is going to happen. And when I talked about it earlier, that these scenarios are going to sound silly to some people because they're going to be extreme. All we want in that moment is for somebody to say something like, I can't imagine how difficult that is. Man, that has to be really tough. What we don't want to hear is, look at the bright side. What do you have to be sad about? Or even worse, if you think that's bad, when I was 7, I had this, and this. Trauma topping is one of the worst things you can do to somebody that's struggling because in that moment, our feelings are the most important ones at that time. And just because you may have had something worse happen doesn't mean that it still doesn't hurt us. So, what I would say is have some compassion, validate what they're feeling, and I would look into talk therapy. I've been on medication for quite a while. I've been on and off. And if anybody's not familiar, you have to be really careful with medication. With um, anxiety, depression, any sort of mental health medication, the SSRIs, when you stop taking them, you can't just come off immediately. You have to wean off. And that can be difficult, especially if you're trying to figure out which medications work. But I had a business partner that tried to quit cold turkey and fell into a very deep depression, and he was in bed for 2 months. He would, when I would call him, he would be crying and he would say, I don't even know why. And it was strictly due at that point to him not properly coming off his medication. But I will tell you, I've tried everything. I've done ketamine treatments, I've done different types of um, drugs and prescriptions. I'm on one now called Lamictal that has been extremely helpful for me. The side effects of a lot of the medications can be difficult. I'll be quite honest because I'm an open book. The first medication that I was ever on for anxiety was called Celexa, and while it was helpful, there were side effects that were very detrimental to my marriage. Um, it wasn't worth it to me for my wife to feel as if I was not attracted to her or that physically we couldn't connect because I was on this medication. That made things worse. So I had a difficult time trying to find what worked for me, but I eventually found it. And that is another one that is just it's so incredibly important. But medication isn't for everybody. Therapy isn't for everybody. You have to find what works for you.
We have a note here. Congratulations to sobriety. Right on.
Yes, I'm so proud of her. So proud of her. Phew, I'm crying a lot on this today. Sorry.
Our audience really connect with you.
Great. Great.
And there's a question here. Is anxiety connected with depression? What can I say to encourage my son to get or talk, to see or talk to a therapist?
It's a great question, and I don't know that I have a very proper answer for it. I don't know that anxiety and depression are connected together. That if you have anxiety, you're going to have depression. They do kind of connect to one another, and there can be some other outlets of that. You know, anxiety can cause a lot of imposter syndrome and some other feelings. When it comes to therapy, look, I never thought it was going to work. I did it as a kid, and I felt like it was just when they're doing critical intervention team training. And it's one of the things that I noticed, and I talk about this when it comes to men. When I first started doing, I was shocked how many people came to me afterwards, especially these men that are kind of hyper masculine, and would pull me aside to tell me that they had never heard somebody talk in a way that they could relate to it, or that they were feeling these things and never discussed it before, and that the CIT training in general had been so eye-opening for them. So I completely understand where, going through the certification and just learning um, about mental illness in general and ways to cope has to be incredibly satisfying and educational. We're all afraid to talk about it, and so we just ignore it and we ignore the subject altogether. So I applaud you for going and getting that certification.
There's one comment here. Still hard to be friends with some who have mental illness. They can also be very hurtful and
Hmm.
unaware.
Hmm. I I am guilty, guilty, guilty of that. At least I was in the past. My abandonment and trauma makes me feel as if I'm not deserving of friendship and love. And I became a people pleaser, and I felt like my only value was in pleasing people, that my value in any friendship was just making everybody else happy. But what would happen is my insecurities in friendships, especially my male friendships, would cause me to go overboard. So I was always overdoing it. I was always, you know, the most supportive. I was always gifts. I was going overboard, but I was expecting that back. And I had to realize that these other people don't have the same insecurities that I do. They don't feel like they need to go overboard. And so I can't get upset with them when they're not doing the same things that I'm doing. And it would cause me to test people a lot. And this is embarrassing to say, but I would do it quite often where I would tell people something, personal or an event coming up, and I would wait for them to check back. I would wait for them to ask for an update like they cared. And if they didn't, I was convinced that they didn't care about me. And I almost wanted them to fail because I felt like it was confirmation of what I already thought, because I didn't know how to deal or understand what care from a friend was. I don't even know if I would have recognized it. And I was doing a lot of damage in my relationships. Two things would happen. One, I would leave relationships and friendships at the first sign of any trouble. That if I didn't hear from somebody in a couple of days or there was a fight with a girlfriend, I had to leave first because the idea or the feeling of them leaving me was going to be tumultuous because I knew what that felt like and I was avoiding that at all costs. It also kept me in very damaging relationships because I didn't want the feeling of being left. So I would constantly go overboard in romantic relationships, buying gifts, putting romantic things together because I was always chasing the next I love you. All I wanted to hear was I love you. And I was absolutely guilty of love bombing for a long time, but it wasn't in a way to try to be controlling or manipulative. It was because I wanted to feel loved. And it was really unfair to my partners. It was unfair to my friends. And it goes back to that whole thing of hurt people. Because I felt a certain way about myself, I was projecting it on everybody else. And I didn't realize that I was holding a mirror up to myself in the ways that I was feeling and projecting that on other people. I'm going to tell this quick story that kind of encapsulates how that would work for me. I would go out with my friends, we'd go to a bar, a club somewhere, and a guy would walk in that was a good looking guy, charismatic, seemed to have it all together, and knew everybody. Everybody loved him. And in my mind, that guy looked across the room and would see me and say, "You don't belong here. You're not one of us. Why are you here?" And I would have an argument in my head with this guy for the next hour. He's going to say this, I'm going to say this back, and I'm ruminating and arguing and arguing. And inevitably, that guy is going to walk to the bar and brush up against me. And I've been arguing with him for an hour, and now I'm gone. Now the anger's kicking in, and I need to teach this guy that I'm just as good as he is, that I belong here. And it has nothing to do with him. It had everything to do with how I felt about myself. And that was a hard pill for me to swallow. Knowing that I spent my whole life trying not to be my father. And what I turned into was somebody that was turning into their father because my idea of conflict resolution from not having a male role model was that fighting was how you resolve conflict. And it was very damaging. And I can understand how difficult it can be to be friends with somebody like me at that time or somebody else that is going through it.